Okay, so today we're doing a recap of lecture 4, which is on brand equity and value. So in this recap lecture, we'll just be covering what we did in more detail in the lecture. So we'll be looking at what is brand equity. So when we talk about the concept of brand equity, what do we actually mean? We'll look at a few different models and processes in terms of deconstructing the concept, and then looking at ways that we can measure brand equity and value in particular. Now, I mentioned Quaker Oats in the lecture. We'll come back to this in a second because it's an example that we've used for an exam paper in the past. So quite an important quote in relation to this. Okay, so Laforet here, we talked quite a lot about brand meaning and how a brand is much more than a product to consumers. But this is Laforet's model that's looking at it from an organisational perspective. Okay, so Laforet's diagram, as we said, is more about looking at the brand from an organisational perspective. So at the centre we have the core product, so that physical element that the organisation makes, that includes all those functional benefits, the value it presents, the features, how the customer uses it, and then surrounding that we have these associations and things that evokes the brand, so different elements that the consumer thinks of when they think of the brand. The country of origin, which might be an important factor that organisations need to leverage. If you look at some of the German car brands, that's quite important to them. The imagery, so any images that are associated with the brand and how the brand is perceived by its customers, and that links in quite importantly with positioning. The emotional and self-expressive benefits that the consumer gets, so the idea that they can express themselves through the brand but also form an emotional connection, which is really important because it's so powerful. The relationships that the customer has with the brand, so that affection that they feel, but also how loyal they feel to the brand. You know, is this a brand they feel married to, or is it just a sort of casual relationship? The symbolic elements in terms of the devices that are employed, the colours that are used, the fonts, anything sort of specific, the shape of the bottle that evokes the brand. Okay, and then personality is considered by some authors, such as Akers, to be by far the most important element. So this is kind of if the brand was a person, what would that person be like? So what is the brand's personality? Aker argues this is much more important than any other element of the brand, because it's this that determines whether the consumer wants to connect with the brand or not. You know, even more important than celebrity endorsement or any other associations that might be built to the brand. That actual personality is the sort of key determining factor in terms of whether customers show a preference for it or not. Okay, so we've looked at this diagram before, and in the next coming weeks we'll be looking at positioning and identity and image, but today we're focusing on equity. So we're really thinking about the value that a brand has. So when we've looked at that last diagram and we're talking about the product and then the surrounding elements of the brand, it's kind of by adding those surrounding elements, what does a brand add? And many authors argue that a brand is an organisation's key strategic asset, and for many organisations it can be their number one source of sustainable competitive advantage. It's really important that we understand how do we both build and then measure brand equity. Let's start off by determining, when we talk about brand equity, what is it that we mean? So we've talked about, from a customer's point of view, the idea that a brand presents much more value than the product alone. From an organisational point of view, by having a brand, it's essentially allowing us to earn a greater volume, so sell more, or greater margins, so charge more than we would without that brand name. So it enables us to derive many benefits, but I guess fundamentally it's the ability to premiumize what we're offering, and charge a greater margin, which leads to increased profitability. And ultimately, for most commercial organisations, this is going to be their end goal. David argues that the idea of brand equities, that many businesses are really starting to realise that they should be It's really kind of supporting the brand as a most strategic and significant asset. So it's one of those things that actually, when we're in times of trouble, so if we look at Thomas Cook going back sort of 7 or 8 years, they were in a similar situation as to what they have been recently. And you kind of recognise that many of the reasons why consumers still had confidence in the organisation despite their really precarious financial situation is because they had a brand that they trusted. Without that brand, the business probably would have folded kind of 10 years ago. So a brand can not only be a source of profitability, but it can kind of save us in times of, in difficult times when if consumers still have faith in our brand, if there's some equity left in that brand, then it can be a source of survival as much as increased profitability. So brands are not only important from a customer point of view in terms of why we connect with them and the meaning that we derive, but from an organisational point of view, they're a fundamental part of any business's strategy. Where do brands come from in terms of an individual brand, and how do they evolve? Well, obviously we start off with a brand being launched at its birth stage, and at this point we're going to work into making consumers aware of that brand. So we make them aware that the brand exists, but then we start to build associations. So we start to add some meaning, and Grant McCracken argues that the kind of meaning we get from a brand in part comes from the advertising and communication. So it's important that we build that distinctive and differentiated meaning around our brand. Consumers then, as they experience brands, start to form quality and value perception. So here we manage the expectations. So like we talked about Ryanair in the seminars last week, and we talked about how might they get away with having a poor reputation. And it's all about managing expectations. So be really clear with your consumers about what it is that this brand represents in terms of what they are likely to experience when they interact with that brand, and manage them carefully. So we're looking to kind of under promise and over deliver rather than over promise and under deliver. That then turn builds brand loyalty, which means that we start to develop relationships with our customers. Customers start to show organisations some of the benefits of having those loyal base of customers, and that allows us to develop extensions. So it may be that we stretch into other product areas or service areas. You look at a brand like Marks and Spencer's, known to be dependable, reliable, trustworthy, perfect kind of brand equity associations to build into selling financial services. So it allows us to stretch into other areas. This is something we will consider in more depth in a later lecture. We just need to be mindful of some of the kind of pitfalls of brand extensions too. Showed this question in the lecture, asked you to think about how you might answer it and what are the sort of key points. Obviously all the stuff we talk about in this lecture is important, but it's kind of you demonstrating that you understand what point John Quaker is making in terms of the fixed assets. So what is he saying? What's the point? He's saying that he'd take the brands and need to be the richer man. So just something for you to think about. It's a past exam question. So, just make some notes as part of your revision. So if we start to break up brand equity, this is one of the models very similar to Acre. It's taken from the Lafayette, but it's a very simple model that breaks brand equity down into these 4 component parts. It's just to build value and equity around a brand. And what Acre and Lafayette are arguing is you need these 4 different elements. And Keller's model is very similar. It talks more about how we build that up into brand loyalty. So let's have a look at the 4 different elements in more depth. Start with brand awareness. Now, brand awareness is interesting. Obviously, if nobody's aware of our brand, if consumers aren't aware of our brand, they're never going to show a preference for it and buy it. There's some interesting research done by a psychologist called Sir Jonk in the 60s, who essentially determined that just by being repeatedly exposed to something and developing familiarity, we then show a preference for something. So he showed, in his experiments, he was showing his participants different shapes. He showed them a different series of different shapes so they became familiar with them. and then performed another test where we showed them shapes they'd seen before and ones they hadn't, and they distinctly showed a preference for the ones that they'd seen before. So just repeatedly exposing your target audience to your brand will lead them to become familiar with it, which will then bring about an attitude change. So they will form an attitude towards your brand based on the attitude towards the object theory. And that will start to lead to them taking a preference or starting to develop some affection. Now, obviously, consumers aren't aware of this. It happens subconsciously. So just by getting your brand out there initially to develop both awareness will help you not only develop awareness of that brand, but also start to develop some preference. I mentioned on the last slide that if a consumer isn't aware of your brand existing, then you're never going to end up as being in their choice set and ultimately being the brand that they purchase. So this diagram just shows you that at each level, the number of brands under consideration by the consumer decreases. So if we look over here, this is all the brands that exist, the total set. These are all the brands the consumer is aware of, all the ones that they consider, which ones make it into their choice set, and then which one they finally purchase. So obviously if we're not aware of a brand, then it's never going to make it into that awareness set. So it's really important that initially, to build any kind of brand equity, that consumers know we exist. Without knowing we exist, they're never going to show a preference and ultimately connect with our brand. We want to build associations because we know that brand meaning is important to consumers, and these are all the things that the consumer thinks about when they see our brand. So it's the kind of driver in terms of the meaning that they derive from the brand that we talked about in the first couple of lectures. Now, it's important that these associations to lead to brand strength, so to give us in turn some equity. They need to be both favourable, so things that the customer's interested in, that are relevant to the customer, that they're going to want to be associated with, and equally unique. So that's kind of that distinctiveness that's important that Mark Ritson talks about. So having some kind of source of differentiation that makes them stand out, then they're not just the same as every other brand, but they've got kind of a more specific, unique identity that's something that the consumer's interested in. So I just use the Body Shop. I don't think I talked through it in the lecture as an example of a brand that sort of sees a gap in the market to provide something that is seen as both a series of beauty products, but equally something that consumers can buy and have peace of mind in terms of ethics. So it's about those kind of really strong associations. Remember, they need to be something the customer's interested in, so favourable, but equally fairly distinct in terms of being unique. So we talked in the lecture about whether the Sky brand, which some of you are familiar with, those of you that are not familiar with this brand, then perhaps have a look, Google it, and have a look at what the brand offers. Whether it decreased or increased its brand equity in 2019, it's actually decreased in brand equity, and we discussed some of the possible reasons around that. So, that really kind of intensified competitive rivalry in the marketplace, lots of substitute products or alternatives, lots of streaming options these days, and subscription-based TV viewing. So there's obviously a highly competitive market. It's going to have an impact in terms of things like loyalty, which will have then in turn an impact on the brand's equity. So in the same way that brand equity is built through these different elements, equally it can decline for precisely those same reasons. The second area of brand equity to consider is this perceived quality. So it's these are kind of the functional and psychological attributes that we get from owning the brand. So what do we expect we are likely to receive? What is that experience going to be like when we engage with it? What are our perceptions around the value and the quality that we're likely to obtain from owning a specific brand? So it's really important that we manage this. Remember, it's perceived, so it exists in the mind of the customer, and perception is everything. So from an organisational point of view, we've got to make sure we manage expectations and that we are able and equipped to deliver on those expectations that we are setting for our consumers. Loyalty is obviously important. So when we start to develop relationships with our customers, they like the brand, they're satisfied with what they're receiving, they become committed to our brand, even to the point where they might even feel a little bit guilty if they engage with a competitor, which is kind of what we want. We know that loyal customers are, they're more forgiving, they're less likely to complain. They essentially are great assets to our organisation because they consistently buy from us, they're reliable, and equally, they don't cause us very much trouble, so they're not a lot of work. We have to look after them, and we know it's much more cost effective to retain a customer than it is to get a new one. But overall, there are huge benefits to having a group of loyal customers. They will talk positively about our brand to other people, so become advocates for the brand. And all of this is really important, but we have to continually manage it. We can't just sort of become complacent and expect customers to keep coming back to us. Remember, like in the Sky example, most brands are experiencing increasing competitive rivalry. So let's think a little bit about how we might measure brand equity. And there are a number of different ways. And in the seminars, we'll be looking at the Interbrand approach and using Apple as an example for you to apply that method. So obviously in your assignments, you can use that methodology. There's a brand audit, which looks at different elements, kind of many of the different aspects we've looked at already, that talks about these different attributes in the first box leading to brand strength. So the fact that we have loyal customers, we've got high market share, we're leaders in our category, and we can charge a price premium, which obviously then leads to our brands having some value attributed to it. Keller's approach is called the CBBE approach, so customer-based brand equity. And Keller talks about this being a model where we build equity. So we use this model to build up from salience, which is brand awareness, into the left-hand side, which is the rational elements, so the judgments and performance that the brand delivers. And then the right-hand side, which is the emotions, the feelings, the imagery. So that's much more kind of the emotional connections, the associations. And we build into these. So imagery builds into feelings. Performance of the brand leads us to make rational judgments about the brand. And all of this builds into resonance. And resonance is brand loyalty. So what Keller's argument is that I guess all elements aren't equal. And the higher up the pyramid you get in terms of your brand, the greater the degree of brand equity. And this really looks at a brand from a customer's point of view. If you look in the module guide, if you look on the electronic version, there's a link to the chapter in Keller's book around this model, and it shows you the questions that Keller would ask as part of if you were going to research with your customers to determine some of these different elements and value your brand. It goes through all those questions that Keller would ask, and it's also got an applied example. I think it's Rolex in there for you to have a look at too. Equally, we have an applied example here that I did myself. This took me a bit of research on the internet and Library Gateway. It took me probably a couple of hours to create. So it's an applied version of the brand equity, the CBBE model that we just looked at on the last slide. And you can see that I've supported all my different points with the secondary research from credible sources. I've also tried to get some balance in here. So if you see in this section in particular, there's kind of positive elements, but equally there's negative elements too. And then we've got some interesting points down here. So what's missing from this in terms of the assignment is that we need some interpretation of what all this means, and that's where you'll get the higher mark. So this is great, and to achieve a 2-1 or a first, you need to be doing this. But equally, you need to be then telling us what it all means. You don't necessarily have to go through every single point and explain every single point, but draw them all together, pick out the ones that are really important, particularly where you make observations that the brand is perhaps not following what theory tells us, because this is your opportunity to be critical. And so you'll see when we start to talk about positioning in the coming weeks that we talk about us having a really clear and distinctive position. And we would question, like, how can a brand like the North Face achieve this if they are appealing to every kid of social strata? So, so it's kind of saying they're appealing to everybody. How do they manage to do that and then still be successful as a brand? So when we're trying to be critical in the assignment, we can use brands to criticise theory and question whether the theory is correct, and equally use the theory to question brands. So we might say, you know, has this not played out yet? Is it still early days? And ultimately, will there become a point where appealing to everybody becomes problematic for the brand? So really draw out the stories around the brand, use the model to draw out useful points for your evaluation, and ultimately places where you might make recommendations. It's actually, even though it comes, I would probably position it towards the end of your assignment, although it doesn't matter. It's actually quite a good starting point for you to get around the key themes, because I might look at this and then think, right, I need to have a section on positioning because of the point that I've just made. I need to have a section on brand promise. I might have a section on identity. So it starts to help you think about what kind of areas do I need to include in my assignment that are going to help me draw out the most effective evaluation, so I can make some really justified recommendations to the brand. On the Interbrand website, this is the place where the list of brands that we're using for the assignment derives from. So it's worth having a look on there. They're an agency. Have a look at how they measure brand equity. They use these kind of 3 areas fundamentally, and we're actually going through the criteria in more depth in the seminars. So we'll look at each different area and apply it to a specific brand. It's definitely worth having a look in terms of just part of your research for your own brand too. So, you know, if we wanted to measure the value of a brand, there are different kind of formulas that we can use to determine revenue. And obviously we look at elements like profitability, market share. It's obviously important that we know the value of our brands, but I guess the brand equity approach in terms of looking at it from a customer's point of view allows us to establish where there might be problem areas. So we might know our equity has declined or increased, but if we haven't got a kind of more forensic brand analysis in terms of equity, we're not going to know why that is. You know, what's going on that might impact on our equity, and therefore how might we repair that? How might we fix it? What might our future strategies need to be? In last week's lecture, have a look on RepTrak and the Reputation Institute to have a look at your brand and see how it performs in terms of reputation, because that's an important measurement too. Be interesting to compare and contrast strength of brand with kind of strength of reputation, and see where again there might be gaps in performance. It's important that we sort of recognise that why do we bother looking at our brand evaluation? Well, as I said on a couple of slides ago, we need to know where our future strategies lie. And by doing a kind of analysis of our equity and plotting the different areas and looking at where we're performing well and where we might need to improve, that helps us determine what future strategies might need to be in terms of our brand management. So it is an important area of brand management, and also to know, you know, how much value does our brand have? What is the equity sitting behind our brand, and how well is it performing? Okay, so just to finish up, equity is obviously that value that sits around the brand, the idea that the brand is worth something to an organisation, and for them it reduces risk, and it's an asset in the same way an organisation might have any other assets. Remember that it's made up of lots of different parts, and being able to define those different parts and understand what they mean is really important. We want to measure our equity and know what our brand is worth, but finding a really sort of definitive approach is difficult. Obviously today we've looked at some quantitative approaches, but primarily qualitative approaches. So we might be able to map our equity, but it's difficult to put a kind of figure on which different element is worth what and why and all the rest of it. So it's just important that you recognise this as a concept and that it's something that you understand and you're able to apply.